Okay, let's take a few minutes to talk about standard costs and variances. So, as we've seen, a budget deals with total costs. Standards are calculated on a per unit basis and can be viewed as the budgeted cost for one unit of product. Standards are often used in the preparation of budgets. So think of a standard cost as a budget for a single unit of product. If a company produces many different products, it will develop a standard cost for each type of product. For example, Colgate-Palmolive will develop a standard cost for each type of toothpaste, soap, and laundry detergent it produces. Even service companies develop standards. The standard cost then becomes the benchmark for evaluating actual costs. So here are some examples of advantages of standard costs. It helps facilitate management planning, promotes greater economy by making employees more cost conscious if they know what the standard is and what they're held to, accountable for. It's useful in setting selling prices since we know what our cost should be or what the standard cost should be. Helps contribute to management control by providing basis for evaluation of cost control. Again, if we know it's similar to our budget, if we know what the standard should be, then we can see where we actually came in. So it's useful in highlighting variances in management by exception, which we'll talk about further, and simplifying costing of inventories and reducing clerical costs. Now, setting standards and quantity standards requires a combination of expertise of everyone who has responsibility for purchasing and using the particular inputs. So in a manufacturing setting, this might include managerial accountants, engineers, purchase managers, production managers, line managers, and production workers. Managers draw on many sources of information when they're setting those standards. So they consider the amount of material and the amount of labor used on each unit of product in the past. They also consider the current cost of inputs, such as the negotiated labor rates and raw materials prices. Finally, they estimate how future changes in the economy or in the manufacturing process might affect the standards being developed. So engineering students help determine the amount of time and quantity of material that should be needed to produce each unit in order to serve as a realistic benchmark. Then once developed, standards need to be kept up to date, so they should be adjusted whenever a long-term change in costs or outputs is anticipated. And they should be designed to encourage efficient future operations, not just a repetition of past inefficient operations. So a standard is a benchmark or norm for measuring performance, and we have two commonly types of standards that we use in manufacturing. And those are quantity standards, which would specify how much of an input should be used to make a product or service. For example, auto service centers like Firestone and Sears have set labor times that it should take to complete certain work tasks. Fast food outlets such as McDonald's have exacting standards for the quantity of meat to be used in a sandwich. And then cost or price standards specify how much should be paid for each unit of the input. For example, hospitals may have standards for food, laundry, and other items. Home construction companies may have a standard labor cost that they apply to subcontractors like framers, roofers, and electricians. And then once we have our standard, we can employ something called management by exception. And that's when we compare our actual results with our standards. So if our standard is the black line, anything over that would be more than we predicted, and any deviations that are deemed significant then would be brought to the attention of management as exceptions. So we will apply this principle as we go forward to quantity and cost standards with an emphasis on manufacturing applications. So this really takes us to this variance analysis cycle, and it's a continuous 5-step process. So you can see we start here with the preparation of a standard cost performance report in the accounting department. And that report is going to analyze variances, which are differences between actual and what should have occurred according to our standards. And then those variances are going to raise certain questions like, why did this variance occur? Why is this variance larger than it was last period? And then significant variances would be investigated to discover their root causes. And then corrective actions would be taken so that the next period's operations are carried out and we start the cycle all over again. Now, ideal standards can only be attained under the best of circumstances. So they don't allow for any work interruptions. They require employees to be continually working at 100% peak efficiency. Now, in the real world, this just isn't practical. So we use something called practical standards, which are high, but they're attainable. So they allow for normal machine downtime, employee rest periods, that can be attained through reasonable, highly efficient efforts on the average worker. Practical standards can be used for forecasting cash flows and planning inventory. So manufacturers typically prepare standard costs for direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead for each type of unit or product. And many companies also prepare standards for operating costs, but we're just going to focus on the direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Okay, so the standard price of a unit for direct materials should reflect the final delivered cost of the materials minus any discounts. So standard quantities would be the amounts needed to meet the production designs, and the standard quantity per unit for a direct material should reflect the amount of material required for each unit of finished product, as well as an allowance for unavoidable waste, spoilage, and other normal inefficiencies. A bill of materials is a list that shows the quantity of each type of material in a unit of finished product. Now, instead of the terms price and quantity used for material, we use the terms rate and time when we apply standard costs to direct labor. Labor rates can be determined by wage surveys of rates in comparable companies or by labor contracts. And the standard wage rate per hour for direct labor includes not only wages earned, but also fringe benefits and other labor costs. Many companies prepare a single rate for all employees within a department that reflects the mix of wage rates earned. The standard hours per unit reflects the labor hours required to complete one unit of product. Standard times can be determined by using available references that estimate the time needed to perform a given task, or by relying on time and motion studies. And that's where they actually go with a stopwatch, and they will watch people perform certain tasks, and they'll keep track of that. Now, for variable manufacturing overhead, we use a rate standard, which is the variable portion of the predetermined overhead rate. The activity standard is the units of activity in the base used to apply our predetermined overhead. So examples of the activity base might be direct labor hours or machine hours, depending on which is used as the allocation base in the predetermined overhead rate. Price and quantity standards are determined separately for two reasons. One, different managers are usually in charge of buying, and one is usually in charge of using that particular input. So, for example, we might have a purchasing manager who's responsible for raw material purchases, and the production manager who's responsible for the quantity of raw materials used. So the buying and using activities occur at different points in time. For example, raw materials purchases may be held in inventory for a period of time before actually being used in production. Now, there are standards for direct materials and direct labor, and there is a direct material standard quantity, which is how much it takes to make one unit, and there's a direct material standard price, the price per unit of direct material. The same standards are calculated for direct labor, except direct labor has hours instead of quantity and rate instead of price. And then rather than using one determined overhead rate, some manufacturers will split their manufacturing overhead into two rates. So we get a fixed manufacturing overhead rate and a variable manufacturing overhead rate. And if you remember, the way that we calculated the variable manufacturing overhead rate was to take the total estimated variable overhead and divide it by the total estimated amount of the allocation base. And then we could multiply that times the standard quantity of that allocation base, and we could repeat that again for fixed manufacturing overhead. So in this particular example, you can see our direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. If we multiply the standard quantity times the standard price for each of those items, we get a standard cost, add them all together. So our standard cost per gallon here of whatever we're producing is $42. Now, managers use standards at the beginning of the period to help with the budgeting process. Managers also use standards at the end of the period to evaluate performance and help control future costs. Managers often compare actual costs against a flexible budget rather than directly against the planning budget. So remember, the flexible budget reflects the total cost that should have been incurred given the actual volume achieved. For example, let's assume that the company actually produced 31,000 cases of chips during the month of January, even though the company originally planned to produce 29,000 cases. So you can see in this exhibit that the flexible budgeted production costs. And to generate the flexible budget, managers multiplied the standard cost per unit by the actual number produced, which is what you can see here. So we get our flexible budget, and then we have our variance. Now, price variances result when we pay an actual price for a resource that differs from the standard price that should have been paid. Quantity variances are based by using an actual amount of a resource that differs from the standard amount that should have been used. And the act of computing and interpreting variances is what we call variance analysis. Price and quantity variance is computed for all three elements. So you can see we've got a materials price variance, labor price variance, overhead controllable variance, and a materials quantity variance, labor quantity variance, and overhead volume variance. So if we add the materials price variance to the materials quantity variance, we get the total materials variance. Or if we add the labor price variance to the labor quantity variance, we get the total labor variance. Same for overhead. Overhead controllable variance plus the overhead volume variance gives us our total overhead variance. So here's the general model for computing standard cost variances. We multiply the actual quantity times the actual price and compare that to the actual quantity times the standard price. Now, the difference is the price variance. Then we compare the actual quantity times the standard price to the standard quantity times the standard price. And this difference is what we call the quantity variance. Although the price and quantity variances are known by different names, they're computed exactly the same way. So the actual quantity represents the actual amount of direct materials, direct labor, and variable manufacturing overhead used. The standard quantity is the standard quantity allowed for the actual output of the period. Actual price represents the actual amount paid for the input used. And the standard price represents the amount that should have been paid for the input that was used. Now we can even reduce those relationships to mathematical equations, which you can see. For example, we can determine the price variance by subtracting the actual quantity times the standard price from the actual quantity times the actual price. And we can determine the quantity variance by taking the standard quantity times the standard price and subtracting that from the actual quantity times the standard price.